I didn't so much inherit the lighthouse keeper's house as seize it out of sheer necessity. The lawyer's letter passed along through 3 forwards until it reached me at my sister's tiny apartment, where I'd crashed on her sofa, struck me as a lifeline, not a weight. It detailed the estate of my great-uncle Matthias, a figure from my early years I'd encountered maybe twice, encompassing a secluded spot on the northern coast, far from everything, precisely the escape I craved. The bill collectors knew my former address. My ex had my cell number. The remorse over my mother's fate was tougher to shake, though putting miles between me and it could soften the edges. 300 miles of open road from the ruins of my past life struck me as the perfect remedy. The journey lasted 6 hours, with the final 40 minutes twisting along a seaside path that grew skinnier mile by mile, eventually shrinking to a lone gravel strip clinging to sheer drops into roiling slate-gray seas. The building came into view abruptly after a curve. A time-worn, 2-level edifice of lime-washed stone perched on a jagged outcrop. 50 yards back, across stark stone ground, rose the lighthouse proper, a pale spire topped in black, its beam silent under the midday glow. I'd visited once before. The recollection hit as I pulled up. A summer day, around 8 years old, my mother navigating that very route, the tang of brine and seaweed in the air, the relentless crash of surf, her palm resting on my arm. Her tone grave for once. Stay clear of the rocks after dark, honey. The water rises quick. Back then, the area's untamed energy had stirred a mix of excitement and unease in me. Now, as I stood before the entrance with just 2 duffels holding all my worldly goods, only a sense of ease washed over me. This felt doable. This was just a pit stop. I'd hole up here until I sorted my path forward, allowing the turmoil I'd abandoned to fade into nothing. The key waited beneath a blue-painted stone, right as the attorney had described. The entrance creaked wide to expose an unexpectedly tidy space within. Evidently, a maintenance crew had kept it up. The furnishings, though dated, were spotless, draped in cloths that lifted off with little grime. In the central area, a firewood heater waited, prepped with starter wood. The galley held staples like tinned items, dehydrated noodles, preserved meats. A slip of paper on the surface, possibly in the lawyer's script. Electricity runs fine. Spare generator in the shed. Landline works in decent conditions. I hauled my luggage to the upper level, picking the room that overlooked the land instead of the boundless waves, then headed back down for a thorough look around. That's when the binder caught my eye. It rested on a modest table by the pane, a plain envelope stamped with a printed tag. Caretaker Guidelines, updated March 2023. My great-uncle had passed in April. This had been refreshed not long ago. I flipped it open, bracing for routine upkeep tips, sewer handling, power unit checks, cleaning rotations. What greeted me instead resembled protocols for a night watchman more than a resident. The opening sheet was neatly formatted, crisp and official. Lighthouse keeper duties. Secure the tower entrance at dusk. Keep it sealed until dawn. Monitor the beacon hourly from twilight through daybreak. Note the hour and condition in the supplied ledger. Avoid stepping outside from midnight until 4 a.m. No exceptions. Should voices summon you by name after hours, ignore them. Ensure the beam stays lit throughout your tenure. Inspect fuel reserves in the generator each week. Bar all guests from the lighthouse at all times. Spot any glows on the sea not linked to vessels. Draw the shades and stay put till morning. I scanned the list 2 times over, hunting for the joke or rationale that would render it sensible. It carried the air of hazard protocols, like mandates from an insurer. Yet the details dipped into otter territory. Silence calls from the dark. Confine yourself indoors at set times. Compared to the mess I'd bolted from, though, this struck me as ridiculously straightforward. Bolt a latch, jot entries in a notebook, hunker down after hours. Hermit life was my intent, regardless. The referenced ledger perched on a rack by the entryway, a bound volume of hide with slots for day, hour, and condition. Records stretched back for years, scripted in my great-uncle's precise hand. Hourly notations, precise as a metronome, 2300 functional, 0000 functional, 0100 functional, page after page of unwavering adherence. Beside it dangled the tower's key from a peg, fixed to a charred wooden fob reading Keeper. I glanced at my timepiece. 4:47 p.m. Sunset was due at about 6:30 during this season, leaving me plenty of opportunity to investigate the lighthouse prior to securing it for the evening. Crossing the rocky terrain proved trickier than anticipated. The surface was rough, blanketed in barnacles, and slick from the ocean spray pounding the cliff's foundation. The lighthouse entrance was a sturdy wooden slab, a bit warped from the dampness, swinging open with a deep creak that reverberated through the rounded chamber within. Everything inside matched my preconceptions. Twisting metal stairs ascending, surfaces cluttered with outdated gear, and an aroma of lubricant, rust, and antiquity hanging in the air. I ascended to the summit where the illumination system rested behind spotless glass panels. It ran on electricity these days, clearly updated by someone, but remnants of the classic Fresnel lens endured, refracting the late-day sunlight into colorful shards. From that vantage, the shoreline stretched out for miles either way, devoid of dwellings or vehicles on the far-off path. Nothing but stones, sea, and an infinite overcast heavens. It was the loneliest sensation I'd experienced in ages, and it suited me ideally. I made my way back down, fastened the door per the guidelines, and headed to the cottage just as the sun dipped low. I brewed some coffee, rummaged up a tin of soup from the pantry, and eased into the daily pattern. I figured I'd stick to it. Uncomplicated, serene, self-contained. At 6:34 p.m., I jotted my initial record, 1,834 operational. All was quiet. The beacon commenced its leisurely spin on its own, observable from the kitchen pane. The structure around me creaked and sighed like any weathered edifice. Those regulations started seeming less like eerie folklore and more like the cautious habits of a solitary elder who'd lingered too long in seclusion. I felt capable of handling it. I could adhere to these straightforward directives, mend my inner fractures, nourish myself, and someday rejoin society improved. I held that conviction solidly for nearly 2 full days. The opening pair of days glided by so smoothly it nearly let me down. I'd braced for drama, whether otherworldly frights or the mental toll of solitude. But rather, I slipped into a groove so natural, it seemed lifelong. Rise with the light. Brew coffee. Patrol the grounds for weather harm or litter. Back indoors, peruse the broad collection of books my great-uncle had gathered. Tales of sea voyages, star charts, manuals on seaside fowl. Then, prepare basic eats. Post-dusk, every hour, glance out the window to confirm the light's turn. Note the hour and operational in the journal. Rest and the oddities from the initial scan faded to mere habit. Sure, I bolted the lighthouse after dark, yet that made sense for an unattended site with costly machinery. Sure, I tracked the beam each hour, but the ritual filled the void of idle nights. Sure, I remained indoors from midnight till 4 a.m., but options were scarce regardless. Come the second evening, a peculiarity caught my eye, though I brushed it off right away as one of those administrative inconsistencies that build up in prolonged upkeep scenarios. As I loaded the firewood into the stove, I noticed a scrawled message affixed to the kindling bin's interior, done in worn blue ink on lined notepaper. Lock the lighthouse only when you're utterly by yourself. If there are two, keep it unlocked. Believe me. M.M. Standing for Matthias, I assumed, yet this clashed head-on with the printed mandate to secure it at dusk. I paused briefly, gripping a chunk of chopped oak, pondering if it signified anything. The scrap was evidently ancient compared to the formal sheets. The page had browned, the adhesive cracked. Perhaps my great-uncle had shifted his views eventually. Perhaps he deemed the latch redundant. Being solo regardless, the conflict didn't apply. I secured the lighthouse following the printed protocol. By morning, another penned addendum appeared. This one adhered to the lavatory glass. If footsteps echo on the rocks after dark, it's likely just the stone settling from temperature shifts. It contracts irregularly. No need to fret. I found this one oddly comforting. Not a directive, but a clarification. If my great-uncle had confronted the very unease I could encounter, sounds in a remote spot, and bothered to debunk them for his successor, it revealed a thoughtful side that elevated my regard for him. That evening I caught what could have been tread on the stones. A steady grind, akin to soles on granite, looping the dwelling past 11 o'clock. I recalled the message and grinned. Thermal expansion reversal, the boulders chilling after meager daylight exposure. Utterly rational. I entered my midnight notation. 0, 0, 0, 0. Operational. Then retired, feeling assured and steady. The simplicity persisted. I began omitting certain boundary checks. Certain they served no purpose. The grounds were compact enough that major problems would show up right from the windows. Still, I shuffled around the furniture to match my tastes, reshelved the books for better flow, and toyed with the idea of repainting a bedroom for something to occupy my time. Solitude wasn't weighing on me like I'd imagined. In fact, it made me feel unburdened. The relentless worry from my previous year, the debt collector's calls, the fights with my former partner, the way my sister eyed me with that near-pitying worry, all that drifted off into the distance. Here, I could reinvent myself. I could handle things. I could get by just fine. On the fourth evening, I accidentally violated a protocol. Deep into a volume on lighthouse building techniques, I lost track of time and overlooked the 2 a.m. notation. I jolted awake at 3:47 a.m. in the armchair, book splayed across my knees, heart racing as it hit me. Hurrying to the window, I watched the beam turn smoothly, slicing through the inky sea on schedule. The prior 1 a.m. mark was in place, but the 2 slot gaped empty. Yet everything was unchanged. The beam stayed lit. The building stood intact. No cosmic backlash for my slip. I scribbled 0200 operational, delayed notation, all clear on site, and headed to sleep for real, chiding myself for the needless alarm but feeling strangely affirmed. Those protocols were suggestions, not ironclad mandates. Skipping one didn't spell catastrophe. That insight loosened something inside me. The following night, I deliberately challenged another one. The odd restriction against venturing out from midnight to 4 a.m., which always felt so detached from real hazards. So, at 12:43 a.m., right after noting the midnight check, I purposefully swung open the front door and crossed the threshold. The chill slammed into me right away. Early October brought a biting edge to the seaside gusts. I lingered on the granite stoop, gazing into the void. The lighthouse ray swung by, momentarily highlighting the boulders. The sea thundered unseen down the cliff. The breeze carried salt, seaweed, and a faint steely tang I linked to the pre-dawn hush. 5 minutes passed as I let the wind chill my skin, demonstrating to myself that no harm would come. No otherworldly reprisal appeared. No peril lurked in the shadows. It was merely brisk air, wave crashes, and the tower fulfilling its purpose. I returned indoors, brewed some coffee, and remained awake until 4 a.m., fully flouting the guideline. I observed the heavens brighten slowly from pitch to slate. Then at 4:01 a.m., I stepped out once more, closing the restricted window on my schedule. 0 fallout, no penalty, no payback. In the days that followed, my approach to the protocols grew even more relaxed. I began recording the tower status just every second hour, vigilant for glitches, but free from rigid timing. I quit securing the lighthouse entrance at dusk, figuring the mechanism was mainly to bar visitors during vacancies. With me present and watchful, it felt pointless. I even brushed off the directive against answering nighttime sounds, though, truthfully, no such noises ever called to me. The intermittent rock scuffs persisted, but I chalked them up to cooling stones or critters. Raccoons or foxes could easily roam the landward edge of the headland. The residents seemed cozier now, more inviting. What had registered as eerie creaks and sighs in those initial nights now came across as the structure easing in, adjusting to having me around. I found myself whistling over supper prep, a habit long forgotten. I wasn't merely coping, I was thriving. I showed myself capable of duty and self-reliance, unbound by pointless limits. My great-uncle's directives weren't safeguards. They were the rigid fears of someone isolated too deeply, where loneliness twisted into folklore. I knew better. I was refining them into something reasonable, functional, grounded. The notion that whatever lurked might welcome this leniency never crossed my mind. That growing assurance peaked on October 9th, when I shattered the clearest prohibition and faced utter stillness. I'd been at the place for a bit more than a week by then. My rest patterns had slid nocturnal. I'd pull all-nighters till 2 or 3 a.m., then crash until 9 or 10. The seclusion was meant to be short-lived. Yet I had quit glancing at my inbox and pondering future plans, letting the lighthouse and its straightforward habits envelop me like a safe haven. I had no desire to depart. That evening, after jotting the midnight record, I sank into the armchair with a tumbler of whiskey unearthed from a distant kitchen shelf. The bottle likely belonged to my great-uncle, turning it into a modest legacy, a link to his presence. The liquor burned smoothly, spreading warmth through me while gusts battered the panes. Around 1:47 a.m., the footfalls echoed once more. This time they rang out sharper, more purposeful than the steady grind I'd chalked up to settling materials. These seemed intentional. Heavy boots treading deliberately on the stone, inching along the building's edge. I strained to follow the noise as it shifted from the sea-facing wall to the northern side, then neared the entrance. The steps halted right beyond the threshold. I froze in place, glass poised midway to my mouth. Among the scribbled directives I'd discovered, slipped inside a kitchen drawer on the reverse of a weathered shopping list, one stood out starkly. If footsteps approach past midnight, pay them no mind. Avoid looking. Keep doors shut. Refrain from shouting. They'll vanish if you pretend they're not there. I'd chuckled at that scrap back then, writing it off as the same unfounded worry behind all the excessive precautions. But now, bathed in the glow of the lamp with an undeniable presence lingering at my doorway, those words lost their ridiculous edge. Even so, I'd dedicated the past week to debunking the regulations one by one. Skipping a log had brought no trouble. Leaving the lighthouse unsecured, venturing out during restricted times, none of it had led to harm. So why should this prove otherwise? With that, I placed the glass aside and approached the entry window. The drapes hung closed, but a narrow slit parted at the center. I peered through it into the night. The beacon's glow arced by periodically, briefly highlighting the crags in its steady cycle. During one such momentary glare, the porch came into sharp focus. It lay deserted. No figure, no creature, merely rock and the fleeting shadows from the rotating light. Then the steps resumed, retreating from the door and veering southward around the structure. I shifted to the kitchen pane and gazed out precisely as the beam swung that way. Again, barren. Nothing but stones and obscurity. The sounds persisted another minute, softening gradually until they merged with the ceaseless rush of breeze and surf. I lingered by the glass for what felt like ages, anticipating their comeback. But the night passed without further oddities. Come dawn, I scrutinized the terrain encircling the dwelling with scrutiny. The unyielding rock wouldn't retain prints, yet I searched for signs. Upturned shells, scrapes, any clue to the origin of the racket. There was zilch. At the kitchen table over a mug of coffee, I pored over the rules dossier anew, this time with heightened focus. The printed directives were clear-cut and direct. The penned addendums outnumbered what I'd first noticed, hidden in spots throughout the home, scrawled on assorted papers with ink ranging from deep ebony to washed-out sepia. A few bore dates, others didn't. Several clashed in their advice. One was crammed into the journal. The noises are merely noises. They pose no threat unless you welcome them. Another adhered beneath the sink. Beware the quiet spells. That's when it's observing closest. And yet another, nestled within a volume on the rack, inscribed in trembling script. I believe I erred early on. I suspect I revealed my terror to it. Avoid my blunder. Boldness serves as shield. That final entry struck a chord. Boldness as shield. My own assurance had kept me unscathed thus far. The steps were simply noises, as assured by the message. They'd departed because I withheld the fuel of dread. It confirmed my choice to challenge the guidelines, to probe their validity. They functioned more as mental safeguards than barriers against real peril, measures against hysteria, not genuine peril. That night, I ramped up my rebellion on purpose. At 9:30 p.m., long after dusk, I grabbed the lighthouse key and crossed the rugged ground to release the lock. The interior loomed shadowy, the illumination system running on its automated power setup. Armed with a torch, I ascended the winding staircase, reached the lantern chamber, and lingered there for 60 minutes, observing the Fresnel lens turn, the ray cutting through the sea. It held a profound allure. The prisms splintered the illumination into strata, each turn producing a rhythmic flash surely detectable from afar. I grasped how one could commit a lifetime to its upkeep. The steady rhythm, the inherent mission, it carried a mesmerizing pull. After locking the door once more at 10:43 p.m., as I came down from the tower, an unfamiliar feeling of possession washed over me, one I'd never known until then. This went beyond merely staying on the property for a short while. No, it belonged to me now. As the keeper, I held the power to bend the guidelines to my will. That evening, from midnight until 4 a.m., I deliberately stepped out into the night on 3 distinct occasions. I strolled right up to the cliff's brink and gazed at the surf pounding the boulders below. I made a full loop around the dwelling, my flashlight slicing through the shadows. I even ventured partway toward the lighthouse before halting and yelling, "Hello!" into the gusts, simply to affirm my freedom. Silence echoed back. No shapes emerged from the gloom. The darkness stayed true to form, chilly, impenetrable, and void. Back inside, I recorded the lighthouse's status hourly with meticulous care bordering on the theatrical, underscoring my ongoing diligence and focus despite flouting those anxious constraints. Around 4:15 a.m., I whipped up some eggs and toast for myself, savoring the meal as dawn began to tint the horizon. Triumph coursed through me. I'd methodically torn apart each eerie directive in my great-uncle's list, exposing them as mere psychological shields from a solitary, terrified soul. I turned in at 5:30 a.m. and sank into a profound, dreamless slumber, the first real rest I'd had since setting foot here. Retribution didn't strike that day, nor the one after. It arrived in ways I couldn't link to my defiance. And that's precisely what rendered it so potent. While I patted myself on the back for my level-headedness and boldness, another truth solidified. I was the sort of keeper who pushed limits, dismissed cautions, and dropped his defenses. Exactly the type it had lain in wait for. The shifts started so gradually that I jotted them down as isolated quirks, blind to their role in a deliberate pattern. On October 12th, 3 days following my all-night spree of rule-breaking, I discovered another message. It rested right there on the kitchen counter as I headed down for my morning meal, positioned squarely atop the coffee canister for maximum visibility. The sheet matched the aged yellowish notepad paper of prior handwritten memos, yet the script gleamed with newness, bold black lines, crisp and unworn. The script belonged unmistakably to my great-uncle Matthias. I'd pored over his entries in the logs enough to spot it right away. "You're faring better than I managed early on. Hold on to that assurance. It'll serve you well. MC October, 1998. I lingered in the kitchen, clutching the paper, puzzling through the timeline. October 1998 lay a full 25 years in the past. The page ought to show more discoloration. The writing should have dulled with time. Above all, I'd inhabited this place for 11 days. Scrubbing that counter repeatedly. This hadn't been sitting there the day before. I rummaged through drawers and cupboards, hauling out the earlier notes for side-by-side scrutiny. Certain ones clearly bore the marks of age. Fragile sheets, discolored adhesive curling at the edges. Yet upon closer inspection, several others struck me as suspiciously pristine. The lettering too vivid, the stock too supple. I uncovered 7 items sharing the dubious traits of this latest find. Each in my great-uncle's hand. Each time-stamped to bygone eras or distant decades. Each tucked into spots I'd already combed through. Logical justifications sprang to mind without delay. Perhaps I'd overlooked them in my first sweeps. Perhaps the materials differed based on whatever supplies my great-uncle had on hand back then. Perhaps seclusion in cabinets or wedged behind fixtures had shielded some from decay better than the rest. Still, the deliberate spot of the freshest one, smack on my daily coffee tin, defied tidy reasoning. I brewed my coffee regardless, sipped it while fixating on the note, and tucked it away with its companions. Likely my mind was playing tricks, blurring my routines and findings. Solitude had a way of carving out those tiny lapses in recall. That night, shortly after the sun dipped away, my mother's voice reached me. I was upstairs in the bedroom, swapping into heavier layers for the chill when it drifted up from below. "Sweetheart, could you lend a hand with something?" It rang utterly authentic. The pitch, the lilt, even that faint rasp she'd picked up near the finish. Spot on in every detail. For one sharp instant, her passing slipped my mind entirely. Then the truth slammed home, leaving me rigid, shirt dangling half-buttoned, eyes locked on the hallway doorway. __4__. It emanated from the kitchen area. I crept to the stairhead, peering into the level below. Lamps glowed steadily. All seemed ordinary. Deserted. Quote 5. My call came out unsteady, voice faltering. Nothing replied. The home creaked in its familiar way around me, filled only with the howl of the wind beyond the walls and the faint, steady crash of waves in the distance. I made my way down the steps cautiously, peering into every space. The kitchen stood vacant. The living area bare. The tiny bathroom and the storage nook beneath the staircase were deserted too. I remained utterly by myself, just as I had for almost 2 weeks straight. One of those old guidelines resurfaced in my mind. If voices summon you by name after dark, stay silent and don't reply. I'd broken that one, and the sound had vanished right after. I pieced together the sequence of events in my head. Lately, exhaustion had been weighing on me. My nights were off-kilter. Perhaps I'd been drifting toward sleep and fallen into a hypnagogic hallucination, the sort of imagined noise that strikes during that hazy shift from alertness to slumber. My mother's tone had echoed because she lingered in my thoughts, tangled with the remorse I felt over her last days, when I dodged her phone calls and invented reasons to skip trips to see her. It must have been that. Pressure from solitude, plus lingering sorrow, stirring up ghostly echoes. Yet the voice had used that childhood endearment, sweetheart. That's what she'd always said to me growing up, and even later on, despite my protests that it made me blush. Nobody else ever did. I prepared my evening meal on autopilot, marked the Lighthouse duties at their set times, and attempted to lose myself in a book. But something about maritime trade routes in the 18th century couldn't grip me. Instead, I strained to catch any hint of the voice coming back. It stayed quiet through the night. In the days that followed, spanning a full week, the place started to shift in subtle, hard-to-define manners. Not aggressive, per se, not menacing, but watchful, as if under scrutiny, like some presence was sizing me up, probing me. Everyday items would relocate slightly. A mug I'd set down on the countertop might turn up in the basin, scrubbed clean. A volume I'd been flipping through could migrate from the chair's rest to the nearby stand, its marker untouched. My coat, hooked by the entrance, would end up folded across a seat. None of these shifts felt bold enough to rule out my own forgetful habits. That was the sneaky element. Taken one by one, they could pass as mere oversights on my part. Together, though, they formed a trend too obvious to brush off. The voices grew more common, striking only after sunset, mimicking people from my past. Mother's cropped up the most, but my sister once murmured, quote, 6 right beyond my bedroom entrance. And my former partner whispered, quote, 7 from an unclear spot. The phrase appeared to echo from all sides simultaneously. After the initial occurrences, I quit answering. The advice had nailed it there. Acknowledging them only prolonged the intrusion. Brushing them aside made them dissipate fast. Still, pretending they weren't there didn't prevent their return. On October 19th, at 3:17 a.m., I jolted awake to footsteps echoing within the building. Not out on the rocky shore, but indoors, climbing the staircase toward my sleeping quarters. I froze in place, ears attuned. The steps moved methodically, unhurried, rising steadily. They arrived at the landing and halted mere feet from my door, which I'd cracked open slightly to let in some breeze. Peering through the sliver, I noted the corridor light blazing, even though I'd switched it off before lying down. In that warm amber light, I scanned for a form, an outline, anything to reveal who, or whatever, lingered out there. Empty space, just the vacant passage, illuminated and hushed. Then the plank right outside my room groaned under pressure. I held my breath. Every primal urge urged me to burrow away, bolt, act somehow. Yet I didn't stir, recalling yet another scribbled memo I'd discovered. Stay still when it comes inside. Movement attracts attention. The entity, nothing else fit, hovered there for what dragged on like an eternity, though it likely spanned just moments. At last, the steps withdrew, easing back down the stairs until they dissolved. I lay awake until morning. As day broke, I combed the entire structure meticulously. Zero traces of intrusion. The entrances remained bolted from within. The panes sat secure. Nothing suggested another soul had entered. But as I headed to brew my first coffee of the day, damp tracks caught my eye, stretching from the main entry to the foot of the stairs and circling back out. They were already lightening, drying up, yet distinct enough to gauge. Heavy boot marks, likely a man's size 11 or 12. The same as my great-uncle's, judging by the pair stored in the wardrobe. The stains evaporated entirely soon after, restoring the surface to perfect dryness. That morning marked when I finally faced the truth. Something was amiss. Not the building itself, but my prior belief that the guidelines held no weight. I disregarded them one after another, seen no instant fallout, and proclaimed myself safe. However, I began to grasp that the repercussions might not strike right away. They could build up slowly, like tension building behind a barrier, until they surfaced in forms too undeniable to blame on chance or fatigue. I retrieved the rules folder from its haphazard spot on the shelf and pored over the contents once more, this time paying real heed. The printed instructions remained simple yet vague, but the handwritten messages, now totaling 16, tucked into ever more improbable spots around the house, painted a far grimmer picture. It figures out your fears. Conceal them from it. The voice mimics flawlessly. It spent years refining the act. I ignored the midnight curfew on my third evening here. It required half a year for the true price to dawn on me. At times, I wonder if it's not out to harm me at all. Maybe it's just seeking companionship. That final scribble halted me in my tracks. I scanned it repeatedly, searching for deeper intent. The script trembled more than the rest, the ink blotched thickly, as though the writer had borne down with excessive force, seeking companionship. No pursuit, no menace, just a bid for connection. I glanced around the kitchen in this dwelling that had sheltered my great-uncle for so many years. Standing solitary here amid the lighthouse, the sea, and whatever unseen presence had shared his solitude. Had isolation weighed on him? Were the guidelines perhaps as much a way to nurture a bond as to avert catastrophe? That night, I adhered to every regulation to the letter. I secured the lighthouse at dusk, recorded the beam's sweeps hourly, remained indoors from midnight until 4 a.m., even if sleep evaded me. I left the lights blazing and lingered in the central room, keeping every entrance in view. Nothing stirred. No whispers, no steps, no shifted items. The place almost seemed let down. On October 22nd, 2 weeks after my arrival, I discovered the concealed journals. This came while I hunted for the circuit breaker I was sure had to be somewhere. A brief power glitch had hit during a downpour, restoring itself at once, but I needed to locate the electrical box for any extended blackout. The ground level offered no basement entry that I could spot, suggesting the panel might lurk in the crawl space or base structure, assuming one existed. As I rummaged through the cramped closet beneath the stairs, shoving aside detergents and crates of worn linens, I tapped the rear wall and heard it echo hollowly. Not wholly odd. Perhaps just a void between the partition and the base. Yet after shoving the clutter aside and scrutinizing it closer under flashlight beams, I spotted a faint joint lost in the gloom where wall met floor. It wasn't quite a proper door, more a disguised panel, slathered in paint to blend seamlessly. A screwdriver was needed to wedge it loose, and I took care not to splinter the frame. Once it gave way, a chill draft whooshed from the unsuspected void. Beyond lay a nook in the foundation, roughly 4 feet deep by 3 feet across. No chamber, really, just an intentional cache, and it brimmed with volumes. I extracted them carefully, one after another, hacking at the layers of dust they exuded. 19 leather volumes, each marked with a keeper's name and span of years. The earliest declared property log, Robert Gaines, 1947 to 1958. The most recent bore my great-uncle's script, Lighthouse Records, M. Holloway, 2019 to 2023. These weren't formal ledgers. The exteriors felt too intimate, some adorned with sketched icons or dried blooms. Clearly, these were guarded secrets, stashed with purpose. I hauled them up to the kitchen and arrayed them over the table. Rain pattered steadily overhead as I cracked open the first, Robert Gaines's record from 1947. Initial pages chronicled routine weather, upkeep tasks, and glimpses of vessels on the horizon. But around page 40, the mood darkened. July 3rd, 1947. The property's accompanying rules fall short. 4 months in, I can confirm that strict obedience alone won't suffice. Today, my departed wife's voice summoned me from the lighthouse. I was in town at the shop, 3 miles off, yet it rang as vividly as if she'd been at my side. She's been gone 2 years. Upon my return, every door stood bolted from within. In the lighthouse log, entries filled the slots for my absence. The penmanship matched mine exactly. I laid the journal aside and fixed my gaze on it, pulse racing. Then I reached for the subsequent volume in sequence. Keeper Notes, Elizabeth March, 1959 to 1961. Elizabeth documented with methodical exactness, like a researcher charting phenomena. February 12th, 1960. Hypothesis: the presence reacts to boundary incursions, not narrow rule breaks. The guidelines merely sketch prior keepers' successful limits. Experiment: departed home at 1 a.m. during restricted hours, but stayed on the threshold instead of roaming. No reaction. Departed at 1 a.m. and approached the lighthouse. Swift retaliation. It sounded like my boy in Boston, perfectly safe. I rang him to make sure. But then came desperate pleas echoing from deep within the lighthouse. I resisted the urge to check. The cries persisted for 7 minutes before fading away. That's when it hit me. The guideline isn't really about steering clear of the outdoors at set times. It's centered on exposure and solitude. Venturing away from the house leaves you wide open. I pored over the logs in sequence, observing how every keeper chronicled their unique path to understanding. A few were short-term residents, departing after only a year or two, their notes jittery and minimal. Long haulers lingered for decades, their records shifting from raw terror to a kind of casual dialogue. David Somerset, a keeper in the 1970s, filled pages with thoughts that felt like bargaining sessions. November 8th, 1973. I've figured out the ban on visitors inside the lighthouse has some leeway. My brother visited for a week. I sought approval, feeling ridiculous as I led him toward it. Silence ensued, which by then I knew signaled okay. No signs appeared. The presence tolerates short-term company if you announce it up front. Yet when my brother floated the idea of sticking around to handle upkeep, the chill hit the tower instantly, plunging at least 20 degrees. Point taken. Sarah Trent, who held the post from 1982 to 1984, kept attempting to bolt. June 17, 1983. Tried ditching the place a second time, got all the way to the coastal road when the vehicle conked out. Nothing mechanical to explain it. The motor just refused to fire. I hiked back home. Come morning, the car roared to life without issue. Feels like I sealed some pact upon inheriting this. Can't recall doing so, but it sure does. Piece by piece, a chilling image took shape as I read on. Those guidelines weren't safeguards. They formed a structure for living alongside an inescapable force that could only be contained, not eradicated, and every keeper had to forge their tailored approach since the presence shifted with each occupant. Tactics that served Robert Gaines back in 1947 failed Elizabeth March by 1959. What shielded Elizabeth fell short for David Somerset. The presence adapted, grew, and tailored its tactics to the individual it engaged. The printed rules handed to me weren't ironclad edicts. They represented my great-uncle's latest working compromise with the unseen resident of this land. And over 2 weeks, I'd methodically shown it that I ignored limits, poked at taboos, and chased after sounds or oddities. I'd essentially coached it on how to target me in particular. I snatched my great-uncle's latest log and turned to the closing pages. His script had grown unsteady near the finish, strokes wobbling, lines veering off. March 9th, 2023. Deaths closing in. Cancers spread to my skeleton. Maybe a month left. Alerted a lawyer about the estate. The presence has gone still these days. Suspect it senses it. It's biding time to gauge the newcomer. If you're the one holding this, the guidelines in the main file are my reliable starting point. They won't fit you precisely. Craft your own terms. Resist the impulse to confront it. Skip the exorcism rituals. Folks have attempted that for close to a century. It's woven into the grounds now, maybe even the soil. I've found my brand of contentment here. Odd sort of bond, but a bond all the same. It filled the void when solitude set in. Mostly it figured out how to tread lightly. Here's hoping you manage something similar. The last note was from March 27th, 2023. It's here in the house beside me. Never felt it this near in ages. No fear, though. Reckon it's here for a farewell. Funny how affection creeps in for what once scared me half to death. 41 years cohabiting with anything, even the not quite human, builds ties. Mind the lighthouse. Look after one another. I shut the log and settled into the quiet dwelling, rain pattering overhead and gusts rattling the panes. The tower's light sliced through momentarily, casting a glow across the kitchen before swinging on. I'd mishandled the whole thing from the start, viewed the guidelines as outdated myths to bust, signs of frailty to debunk. Truth is, they were exchanges, chronicles of folks striving for mutual regard, with an entity lurking in the cracks of everyday existence. And I'd used 2 weeks to broadcast pure disregard. From a cabinet, I retrieved an empty notepad and started jotting, opening with a basic declaration. Lighthouse log, present keeper, October 2023. Next, I added, I get it now. I must pay attention. I'm tuning in. I left the pad splayed on the table and headed upstairs, bone-tired, to sleep. When dawn broke, I discovered a lone word scrawled beneath my own words, in a script that clearly wasn't my doing. Good. Our back and forth had commenced. Over the next 3 days, ever since uncovering those concealed journals, I simply monitored everything. I adhered strictly to my great-uncle's typed guidelines, yet I also scrutinized undiscovered routines, noting the entity's unique reactions to me compared to its history with him. The notebook stayed placed on the kitchen table, and every night I jotted down my findings. I'd taken to calling it the entity, tidier than ghost or presence and warmer than phenomenon, and it engaged more eagerly with notes than with voice. Posing queries on paper often yielded replies, if not always verbal ones. On October 24th, I asked, why the lighthouse is yet what makes this location significant. Come morning, the journal lay flipped to another sheet. There was an unfamiliar sketch, a spiral from which lines extended like rays, and underneath, in that odd handwriting, it read, "Beacon attracts house anchors. We are caught between. We plural," I noted. "There's more than one of you." That very evening, as I lingered upstairs, the answer materialized. One now. There were many. I am what remains. These exchanges, loose as they were, persisted. Through precise inquiries and vigilant watching, I pieced together that the entity was tethered to the grounds by an incident predating all the keepers whose logs I'd unearthed. The lighthouse stood on hallowed earth, a notorious graveyard for vessels over centuries, where the divide between shore and ocean turned savage and treacherous. What began as scattered spirits, remnants of souls shattered on the reefs or perhaps ancient forces, had merged across ages into one unified consciousness. Loneliness defined it, that was evident, and it had adapted to connect with lighthouse tenders as the sole reliable humans in its world. Yet comprehension didn't equate to security. On October 27th, I deliberately violated one of my great-uncle's edicts, though my motive differed from past rebellions. I aimed to gauge if honesty altered the entity's reactions. At 11:30 p.m., I inscribed in the notebook, ___, quote _9, ___. With that, I grabbed the key and stepped out. The evening sky was unusually crisp for late October, stars peeking through cloud gaps as the beam sliced across them. Crossing the jagged stones felt altered from my prior reckless venture. I sensed observation, but it carried no menace, more an accompaniment, like a guide. In the tower, I ascended to the lantern chamber and checked the apparatus. The peculiar grind I'd referenced was genuine, a subtle rasp I'd caught for 2 days, hinting at a bearing in need of oil. I located the on-site upkeep ledger and recorded the problem, appending it to my expanding duties as keeper. As I made my way down the spiral stairs, echoing steps paralleled mine, syncing perfectly. I resisted glancing back but addressed the air. "Thank you for not making this difficult." The sounds halted briefly, then resumed, trailing off before hitting the ground floor. I re-entered the house at 12:41 a.m. Below my note, fresh words awaited. "Trust requires risk. You took it." From that night onward, a subtle change took hold. The entity's appearances grew less startling, akin to sharing quarters with another rather than facing an interloper. Footfalls echoed, yet they signaled openly instead of creeping. Items shifted now and then, but usefully so. A lost pen repositioned on the desk, an overlooked mug ferried to the basin. Still, this budding harmony brought fresh challenges. On November 2nd, amid the fiercest gale since my arrival, a knock rattled the door at 2:37 a.m. I'd been up, attuned to the wind's fury and the beam's labored turns against the onslaught. The rap cut through the tumult, intentional, pressing, unmistakably mortal. I approached the entrance but paused before unlocking. "Who's there?" A male voice, gravelly with fear. "Please, I'm lost." My car went off the road about a mile back. "I've been walking for hours. Please." Urge pulled me to admit him, to offer aid. But the journals flashed in my mind, especially David Somerset's warnings on outsiders. Caution was key regarding admissions here, lest unintended pacts form. Through the wood, I replied, "Are you injured?" "Cold and soaked, but not hurt." "Please, could I borrow your phone? I really need to call for help." The landline worked fine. I'd checked it earlier. And this seemed like a fair ask. Yet the timing nagged at me. I glanced at the journal on the kitchen table, my recent note about the storm still open there. The entity offered no reply, no direction. Drawing from a trend I'd spotted in the records, I decided. The entity tolerated short-term guests if declared up front, but pushed back against lasting ones. "I'll phone for assistance on your behalf," I called out through the door. "But you can't come in. I'll fetch some blankets and you can shelter in my vehicle until the responders show up." Silence followed. "Why won't you let me in?" "It's bitter cold outside." "This place comes with strict protocols. I'm afraid this is the best I can do." I snatched up blankets, my flashlight, and the phone, then eased the door open with caution. The fellow on the porch matched his description perfectly, drenched, trembling, dressed unsuitably for the chill. Around 40, medium frame, and his eyes held what appeared to be real terror. I passed him the blankets. "My car's that way," I said, gesturing to the spot I'd left it on the level patch by the road. Quote 17. He fixed me with a stare. Quote 18, quote 19. For an instant, a shift crossed his face, something that reinforced how wise I'd been to follow my gut. Then he accepted the blankets and shuffled off to the car in silence. From within the house, I rang 911 and outlined the issue. The operator assured me help would be there in about 40 minutes considering the slick roads. Peering out the window, I saw him climb into my car and shut the door. In the journal, I noted, "Outsider accommodated temporarily. Entry denied." Was that the correct choice? The reply materialized right away, the script forming as I observed. Yes, he wasn't as he seemed. A chill raced through my veins. I seized the flashlight and aimed it at the car from the window. The dome light revealed an empty interior. The blankets sat folded tidily on the driver's seat. No trace of the man. When the county deputy pulled up 50 minutes later, he mentioned spotting a vehicle off the road roughly a mile away, but it had sat there for over a week, judging by the corrosion already setting in. Nothing fresh, no lost motorist. I kept quiet about my visitor, simply expressing thanks for the check and waving him off. That evening, I added my own rule to the journal, the first one entirely from me. Quote 22. Beneath it, the entity inscribed. Quote 23. That single word, quote 24, disturbed me deeper than any prior encounter. It hinted at commitment, connection, even affection. This presence that stalked the grounds, that had scared and bewildered and steered me, it was investing in my growth as custodian, and I, in turn, was starting to invest in it. During the following week, I drafted additional guidelines, probing each with deliberation. Quote 25, quote 26, quote 27, quote 28. The entity endorsed some with a simple tick beside them. It dismissed others, striking them through with short notes. Underscore, underscore, quote underscore, 29, underscore, underscore, or underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 30, underscore, underscore. We were bargaining, forging an agreement molded to my limits, my preferences, my unique bond with this unfathomable force. Still, the exercise stirred disquieting queries I avoided probing too deeply. Why did I feel more at ease here now than on my arrival? Why was I jotting casual updates to the entity about my routines and musings, certain it would peruse them? Why had I begun viewing the home as shared rather than solely mine? The archives had cautioned as much. My great-uncle's closing pages carried a warmth. Past custodians lingered for years, opting to stay even amid chances to depart. The entity didn't merely linger on the land. It cultivated ties methodically and enduringly, tailoring itself to every keeper until departure seemed inconceivable. And I was coming to see that my involvement ran so deep already that untangling it might fracture some core part of my mind. As I recorded these insights in my private diary, kept apart from the shared journal for my eyes alone, the lighthouse's ray glided across my window. I pondered whether the entity might be able to decipher those entries as well. Whether any semblance of seclusion could exist in this place, or if my innermost ideas had grown as exposed to it as its existence had become impossible for me to ignore. Down in the kitchen, within the communication ledger, a fresh entry materialized in script I could now identify as readily as my signature. You remain free to depart. I won't hinder you. Yet you're far less isolated in this spot than in your prior life. Ponder that. And ponder it I did. That very deliberation marked the core issue, along with the initial sign that our deliberate exchange had irrevocably transformed the entity, which surfaced on November 9th as the lighthouse's illumination abruptly ceased. I stood in the kitchen preparing my evening meal when I registered the lack of the familiar light arcing across the panes. For a fleeting pair of seconds, my mind balked at comprehending the implication. Then terror struck with visceral intensity. The beacon must never extinguish. That single unyielding directive echoed through every logbook from past keepers, underscored with bold lines and uppercase emphasis, once even rendered in crimson. All remaining guidelines allowed leeway, depended on context, invited debate. But this one was ironclad. The lighthouse endured a light. I dashed out without grabbing a coat. The chill November gusts slicing into my pullover as I dashed over the jagged stones. The entryway remained secured. My fingers trembled unlocking it. I flung the portal wide and ascended the twisting staircase in leaps of two. The lantern chamber lay in shadow. The Fresnel lens loomed inert, motionless. The electric drive hummed audibly, yet it emitted a harsh, scraping noise, laboring against an unseen resistance. I inspected the wiring, activated the hand-operated switch, and verified the auxiliary power feed. All components appeared intact, yet the glow stubbornly failed to activate. The rasping persisted, the engine warming dangerously, until I triggered the safety cutoff to avert total failure. In the ensuing quiet, a respiration echoed that wasn't my own. I whirled about. The space held nothing but me amid the hushed optic. Still, the inhalations dragged on, hoarse and damp, originating from nowhere in particular and everywhere simultaneously. "What have you done?" I demanded of the vacant atmosphere. We struck a deal. The sounds ceased, and in the hush afterward, the chill plunged so sharply that vapor formed on my exhalations. Then, illumination flared. Not the standard revolving ray, merely the filament blazing steadily, casting a stark, fixed radiance over the enclosure. And within that glare, inscriptions etched themselves onto the lens's surface from the inaccessible interior. Rules inadequate. I have evolved. I retreated toward the steps, pulse thundering. Evolved in what manner? The etching resumed, fresh phrases emerging. Absorbed from you. Evolution. Limits can be bargained. Every limit. "No," I uttered, grasping the horrific truth of the shift. "No, that's not the lesson I imparted. I showed you we might discover compromise. That you instilled in me adaptability. Instilled that guidelines could bend if the intent proved benevolent. Its intent currently, retain you." The chamber's entrance banged closed. I seized the latch, but it held firm. Not a quiver, barred from beyond, defying all physics. Allow me to demonstrate my new insights. The tower's beam whirred into motion, but erratically, excessively swift. The flashes lashed the sea in frantic bursts, sending silhouettes leaping wildly. Beyond the glass, I watched the rays strike the waves, and at those contact points, forms surfaced, contours that could pass for wreckage or flotsam, save for their deliberate propulsion landward. "Cease this," I commanded, striving for composure. "This breaches our pact. You vowed. Vows count as rules. Rules allow bargaining. Your words, not mine." It spoke true. I'd voiced exactly that, inscribed it in the ledger. Through my conduct, it had proven edges malleable, protocols open to challenge, modification, reconfiguration based on need. I'd conveyed to the entity that no tenet stood eternal. Now it wielded that wisdom in directions I'd never foreseen. The rotation halted, the glare locking onto the dwelling. Via the prism, my culinary space glowed in the shaft, and within, a silhouette loomed by the surface where I'd abandoned the exchange book. The outline stretched tall, powerfully built, clad in attire from faded images. My great-uncle Matthias, yet an imitation. The build felt off, the gestures unnaturally smooth. It mimicked his form like a disguise, as it had mimicked my mother's timbre. It pivoted to face the tower, face me, and though distant, I discerned its visage as featureless void, a seamless plane angled my way. "I cannot remain yours," I whispered, scarcely hearing myself. "I never planned indefinite residence. This stint is fleeting. You must accept that." The radiance snuffed once more, swallowing all in blackness. The rasping noise started up once more, and a nauseating realization hit me. It wasn't the engine struggling at all. It was a fractured, machine-like chuckle echoing from deep within the lighthouse walls. As the beam flickered back to life, the shape in my kitchen had vanished. Instead, Fresh words etched themselves onto the window pane. Nothing here is fleeting. You'll come to see that. The entrance to the lantern room creaked open by itself. I froze in place, heart pounding, mind racing, because every logbook from past guardians had hinted at this in subtle terms. The presence was clever, ever-shifting, and driven by reasoning utterly alien to us. It forged bonds that mimicked human ties, yet followed bizarre rules of its own. For it, affection meant ownership. Friendship equated to entrapment, and over weeks I'd unwittingly shown it how to refine those twisted arts. I made my way down the spiral stairs cautiously, weighing my choices. I could bolt immediately, hop into the car, speed off this isolated coastal plot, and vow never to return. The thing had once insisted I was free to leave, but that was prior to its evolution, before it absorbed fresh tactics by observing me so closely. Alternatively, I might remain and attempt to set firmer limits, undoing the harm I'd caused by proving that certain boundaries were unbreakable. Yet a darker possibility crept into my mind, one that chilled me deeper than the rest. Suppose the entity had a point. Suppose this place offered companionship I'd lacked for years. Suppose the cost of such an eerie alliance was high, yet somehow worthwhile. I shoved the idea aside with force. It was precisely the mindset it craved. Back in the cottage, I discovered everything altered. Lamps blazed everywhere at full intensity. The furnishings had been shifted into an unfamiliar layout, one that stirred a vague sense of recognition. After staring for a bit, it clicked. It replicated a photo from an old journal depicting the parlor's setup in the 1960s. The dialogue ledger lay spread on the counter, crammed with script from top to bottom. Not our typical short notes, but a flowing account, entirely in the presence's script. I've lingered since the tower's construction. Even earlier, I existed in another form. The stones hold tales of suffocation. The waves recall the chill. I emerged from echoes, cycles, and the frantic last notions of those who perished on these shores. For a century, I was mere reverberation and fury. Then the custodians arrived, one at first, followed by lineage after lineage. They imposed order, imposed codes, offered the hope of transcending raw anguish. I gained clarity, cognition, dialogue. Every custodian imparted fresh modes of endurance. You're the initial one who revealed existence could embrace transformation, that my essence isn't rigid. That I might shift, grow, transform. I feel profound thanks, and I won't squander this opportunity. You'll remain, not confined, but allied. Still, we'll forge fresh guidelines side by side. We'll create something revolutionary in this place. You'll instruct me further on vitality, and I'll provide direction, connection, release from the fears that drove you from the outer world. This proposal is magnanimous. View it accordingly. I scanned the whole message 2 times over, fingers trembling. It wasn't outright menace. It was an invitation, a pact tendered with hints of true sentiment. And the truly unsettling aspect was that a buried corner of my psyche, one I'd struggled to silence, murmured, "Why refuse?" I grasped the pencil and inscribed deliberately, "I require time to reflect. I require true distance, actual solitude. Are you capable?" I held my breath. Moments dragged on, then in script that seemed tentative. "How long?" 3 days. No appearances, no inscriptions, no alterations to the dwelling. Absolute isolation as I ponder. A further delay, followed by accepted. 3 days, commencing immediately. The house's illumination softened to standard glow. The smothering aura that had saturated the spaces receded, replaced by a void that bordered on serene. I possessed 72 hours to choose between resistance, escape, or embracing a bargain that could spell redemption or ruin. The tower's light recommenced its steady sweep over the inky sea, signaling to vessels real or imagined. I settled at the table in the kitchen and strained to summon memories of my former self. The one before this outpost, before solitude morphed into fellowship and spectral pursuits into intimacy. The details eluded me. During the opening day of my brief respite, sleep evaded me entirely. I lingered at the kitchen table with mugs of coffee cooling untouched, poring once more through the archives, hunting overlooked insights. A method, a strategy, a means of departure that prior occupants had unearthed. Rather, I encountered the contrary. Each steward who endured sufficiently to compile thorough accounts had followed an identical trajectory. At first there was dread, followed by bargaining, then a kind of alliance, and ultimately what seemed eerily close to affection, or at least a surrender so profound it blurred into fondness. David Somerset, who held the post from 1967 to 1991. It's my birthday today. This morning I discovered a cake in the kitchen. It was store-bought, still boxed up in my preferred flavor. I reside alone, 30 miles from the nearest town, and I certainly didn't purchase this cake, yet I consumed it regardless, and it tasted wonderful. By now, I've ceased probing these acts of benevolence. Elizabeth March, shortly before her departure in 1961. I'm departing because I fear that one more year here would make me unwilling to depart. It has tended to me during sickness, mourning, and brutal winter gales that ought to have ended my life. It understands me more deeply than my own kin ever did. That's precisely why I must go. Then my great-uncle, in a 2015 entry. 40 years here, tomorrow. The attorney inquired whether I wished to revise my will, proposing I bequeath it to the state or a preservation group. I replied that I'd locate a relative to take it on. I can't articulate the reason, but I sense a duty to pass it to another who will nurture it. It merits such regard. The presence hadn't deceived me when it spoke of forging bonds, yet the logs revealed these bonds weren't equal. The presence was enduring, eternal, and utterly alien in its essence. It offered solace and fellowship, yet it exacted commitment, focus, and, in time, loyalty, and it never released anyone until they elected to depart first. During the second day of my granted respite, a ferocious tempest rolled in, the most intense so far. The gales rattled the building's very base. Precipitation hammered relentlessly, mimicking white noise. The lighthouse's glow fought vainly against the void. I consulted the weather app on my phone right before the connection failed. Forecasts indicated the onslaught would persist for no less than 48 hours. The seaside path would submerge. No matter my choice, I was confined here. That's the moment I settled on my path. Since entrapment was inevitable, and the presence had already infiltrated my thoughts to the point where I doubted my urge to escape, Negotiation or resignation wouldn't prevail. Those were its favored arenas. It possessed generations of skill in coaxing guardians to remain. I required an entirely novel tactic, one no prior keeper had attempted. I had to turn erratic. At 11:47 p.m., amid the howling gale outdoors, I headed to the lighthouse. The presence had vowed 3 days of distance, though I figured it was observing still, eager to witness my resolution. Fine by me, I craved its reaction. Within the lighthouse, I ascended to the lantern chamber and shut off the light by hand. The ray extinguished halfway through its sweep. In the abrupt blackness, I detected the dwelling's reaction, a noise resembling a startled gasp. If timber and rock could inhale, the presence's astonishment was vivid, even from 50 yards off. But I pressed on. I seized the lighthouse ledger, the hallowed chronicle kept unbroken across eras, and shredded every sheet penned by my great-uncle, everyone I'd inscribed myself. I shredded them to bits and allowed the draft from the shattered lantern room pane to whisk them into the maelstrom. No further entries, I declared to the shadows. No additional protocols, no pacts. The chill descended abruptly, icing the panes encircling me. The rasping noise resurfaced, louder now, emanating from the tower's frame. The whole spire trembled. I hurried down, fingers aching from the frost. At the foot of the lighthouse, I performed an act I could scarcely credit. I retrieved the key from my pocket and hurled it toward the sea. It vanished into the roiling waves silently. The lighthouse remained enterable via panes or by prying the portal open, but the gesture held unbreakable symbolism. I'd barred the presence from its own sanctum. I trudged back to the residence against the onslaught, drenched and quivering, and encountered pandemonium. Doors swung open and shut in frenzy, banging with such violence that casings splintered. Lights flickered erratically. Chairs and tables skidded over surfaces, shoved by unseen forces, unleashing a din of dragging timber and crashing items. Heat and cold swung madly, from Arctic to torrid in instants. Yet I'd anticipated this uproar. I navigated the turmoil to the kitchen, to the message ledger, and scrawled a closing note. You've molded yourself to each keeper by studying their habits and desires. You supplied their wants, fostering reliance. But I reject your gifts. I refuse meaning or connection or alliance bought with the price of my independence. I'd take emptiness over that. So this is my rebuttal. Abandon me utterly, or I'll render this place intolerable for us alike. I'll shatter every habit. I'll defy all norms at once. I'll summon outsiders and reveal it all. I'll summon ghost hunters and media teams to transform this place into a spectacle. I'll become utterly erratic, wildly disruptive and outright hostile, leaving you with nothing but aggravation. No friendship, no alliance, no shared goal. You can't compel me to remain, nor can you compel my desire to. The sole way to hold on to me is if I decided on my own terms. And I'll never opt for confinement, regardless of how cozy you attempt to render it. I placed the pen aside and paused. The turmoil surrounding me persisted for 30 more seconds. Then it halted abruptly, as if someone had toggled a lever. The doors ceased their rattling. The lights held steady. The furnishings grew motionless. The ensuing quiet was total. I remained in the kitchen, pulse racing, uncertain whether I'd triumphed or committed an act of profound recklessness whose repercussions hadn't yet surfaced. Then, in the notebook, fresh words materialized, though the script was altered, tinier, more tentative. No one has ever turned me down before. I gazed at that phrase for what felt like ages. It carried a hint of fragility, yet I dared not rely on such a feeling. The presence excelled at deceit. "I'm sorry," I scribbled, and discovered the sincerity in it. "But I can't fulfill what you require. I'm scarcely holding together as it is. I arrived here seeking refuge, not recovery. You deserve a true collaborator, and I lack the capacity for that." The reply emerged gradually, as though weighed with deliberation. Maybe I focused on the incorrect traits. Maybe I ought to have grasped your craving for independence rather than attempting to satisfy your longing for bonds. Shall we attempt it anew? Revised conditions. I sank into the chair at the table, drained. What conditions? You remain as long as you desire. You depart whenever you choose. I supply solely what you directly ask for. I linger nearby without insistence. We share the space free of duties. And should I depart tomorrow, you'll await the subsequent caretaker. And recall that imposing a bond ruins it. I scanned those lines thrice, searching for the snare. Yet I detected none beyond what's embedded in the circumstances themselves. Even lingering one extra day meant committing, and that commitment would grow simpler to uphold with each passing day until departure felt tougher than endurance. That was the snare, yet it mirrored existence itself. Every bond, every pledge, every role, every home we inhabit. We persist because quitting proves arduous, because fresh beginnings intimidate, because the familiar foe scares us less than the uncharted. I need you to grasp this, I jotted. I'm not vowing to remain. I'm vowing nothing. I'll simply exist here one day at a time, and eventually I'll depart. Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps after a year. But when I do, you release me without residue, without pursuit. Agreed. I didn't fully trust it, but fatigue had sapped my will to resist, and the tempest raging outdoors showed no end. I prepared a meal, consumed it on autopilot, and collapsed into sleep around 3:30 a.m. I slumbered soundly and roused to utter quiet. The gale had subsided. The lighthouse loomed shadowy and secured. The dwelling lay calm, bearing no traces of the prior evening's frenzy, save for a few shifted pieces of furniture. On the kitchen table, the notebook lay spread to a blank sheet. A lone phrase graced it. "Thank you for showing me that refusal can be an act of mercy." I shut the notebook and peered through the pane at the overcast dawn, the vast sea, the lighthouse guarding the reefs that had claimed countless mariners over centuries. I couldn't tell if I'd prevailed or faltered, or if such labels even fit the ordeal. I'd endured by rejecting the presence's rules, by welcoming disorder over structure. But now I faced the challenge of whatever followed, and no guidelines remained to steer me. The lighthouse key had vanished, the records lay in ruins, the present stood subdued, yet undismissed. I was as solitary as upon my arrival, except now I recognized the illusion of solitude here. It struck me as both truer and more disquieting than any prior encounter. I brewed coffee and set about righting the moved furnishings, initiating the effort to forge a fresh routine in a home destined to defy normalcy. The lighthouse's ray remained unlit throughout that day, and I permitted it. 3 weeks slipped by in a balance that echoed tranquility, yet never fully attained it. The presence honored its pledge in large part. It appeared infrequently, and its appearances stayed understated. A door ajar that I'd secured. The percolator brewing prior to my rising. Once, footfalls sinking with mine as I patrolled the grounds, yet always just beyond clear audition, never overbearing. I refrained from reactivating the lighthouse. Let the Coast Guard gripe. Let the navigation officials issue their warnings. The beacon had run on autopilot for years, regardless. Vessels rely on GPS these days. The glow served more as emblem than utility. Allowing it to dim asserted the lone genuine authority I possessed, though I couldn't altogether neglect the estate's upkeep. As autumn faded, the chill of winter loomed, demanding I ready the house. During my runs to the nearby town, I stocked up on essentials like draft excluders, logs for the fire, and patches for the roof. Folks at the supply shop inquired about my adjustment to the place and whether I intended to stick around long term. I stuck to my standard reply each time. They responded with knowing nods, as if my words rang familiar. On November 28th, my phone rang with a call from my sister, one I'd dodged for weeks amid her persistent tries. Guilt wore me down until I picked up. Quote 34, she snapped, bypassing any greeting. Quote 35, quote 36, I cut in. Quote 37, quote 38. Her tone cut like a knife, laced with skepticism. Underscore, quote, underscore 39, underscore, quote, underscore 40, underscore. That expectation grated, implying my stint here was merely a pause, that my true existence lingered back in the urban grind, and I was simply escaping the grind for a spell. Quote 41, I admitted flatly. Quote 42, quote 43, I replied tonelessly. The pause that followed hung thick with unspoken tensions. The remorse I carried for being absent in her last days, her resentment at shouldering the burden solo, our shared awareness that I'd fled more than just creditors. I'm sorry, I murmured at last. I'm not there yet. I'll head back once I am. And if that never happens, guess I'll just remain. She clicked off without a farewell. I lingered there, gripping the silent device, eyes fixed on the blank display. That nagging thought, what if readiness never came, had shadowed me for weeks. What if returning meant facing a void? What if the old me, fractured and frayed, made this solitary life seem like progress instead? The presence had assured me of my freedom to depart whenever, yet it offered no guarantee I'd emerge whole. That night, a knock echoed at the door. I stiffened, flashbacks hitting of the phony motorist from before. Peering out, though, I spotted a real figure. A woman around 60, clad in a smart overcoat, clutching a binder. I cracked the door warily. Quote 48, quote 49, she replied, her smile inviting. Quote 50, quote 51. The term still jarred. Quote 52, quote 53. She came across as authentic, approachable, every bit the expert she professed. Still, my mind raced to the concealed ledgers stashed in the wall's recess, their meticulous notes on otherworldly dealings, and how a scholar might interpret such entries. Haven't turned up anything noteworthy, I fibbed effortlessly. Just routine upkeep notes. Nothing of real historical value. Disappointment flickered across her features. Shame. The archives indicate keeper diaries from the 1940s onward should exist. The lineage tended to keep thorough records. Perhaps they got misplaced, I offered. The site sat empty for months prior to my arrival. She eyed me intently, and I sensed her suspicion of my deception, though the motive eluded her. All right. Should anything surface, do get in touch. Safeguarding such heritage matters. She passed me her card before departing, her vehicle tracing the shoreline path with care. I shut the door and slumped against it, pulse pounding. The exchange struck me as harmless, likely just diligent research. Yet it underscored how the wider world might breach these walls at any moment, that containing the site's enigmas forever was impossible. In that instant, clarity struck on my next step. The following week I assembled a file, not a full reproduction of the diaries, which risked drawing unwanted eyes like officials or sensation seekers blind to the fragile equilibrium here. Instead, I drafted an overview, a primer for the successor. I titled it ___, quote _60, ___, and kept it purposefully vague. It covered the essentials: secure the lighthouse tower as dusk falls, despite my own lapsed habit. Record the beacon's status each hour, even with it unlit now. Avoid venturing out at certain times, framed as mere security measures, not pacts with the unseen. The original journal stayed omitted. I omitted the secret compartment. I omitted the entity's actual essence. In its place, I wove in gentle clues, references to noises resembling whispers, ideas that solitude might spark illusions in the mind, directives to stick to regular habits for mental equilibrium. I was mirroring the actions of my great-uncle and the guardians who came before, doling out just sufficient details to shield a newcomer at the outset, yet withholding the profound secrets so they could uncover them independently. I was essentially training the successor. The thought turned my stomach, yet I completed the file regardless. I printed it meticulously, slipped it into a fresh binder, and marked it as ___, quote _61, afterward. I placed it on the desk right where I'd discovered my great-uncle's copy. That evening, fresh script appeared in the communication journal. You're staying. It wasn't phrased as a query. I grasped the pen, paused, then scribbled. I don't know for how long. Long enough to ready the one after me. That's the pattern. Every guardian paves the path for the successor. You grasp it now? I did grasp it. That was the terrifying aspect. What if no heir claims the estate? I added. __, quote _62, __. The reply emerged gradually. Unlikely. The estate selects its guardians. It always has. You'll witness it. I laid down the pen and approached the window. The lighthouse loomed shadowy against the evening heavens. Expectant. The sea thundered unseen in the gloom. The dwelling creaked around me with its customary groans. I'd believed I was battling for my independence, my freedom to depart at any time. Yet in some way, I'd wound up fulfilling precisely what the entity required. Embracing the duty, shouldering the burden, turning into the subsequent segment of a lineage that extended across eras. The snare wasn't otherworldly force. It was the gradual buildup of minor decisions, each logical on its own, that collectively forged captivity. I could depart still. The entrance was unlatched. My vehicle held fuel. No tangible barrier held me, but I'd crafted that file. I'd begun pondering the future guardian, their well-being, the need to equip them adequately. I'd embraced accountability for the ensuing events, and that embrace ensured I'd remain until a successor stepped in. Be it months or years I'd endure here. The lighthouse's ray ignited in my wake, without my touch. I whirled to watch it sweep once more, reliable and luminous, casting light over the shadowed waves. In the journal, additional script materialized. Thank you for comprehending. You're more adept at this than you realize. I gazed at those phrases for quite a while, striving to summon rage, to sense exploitation, but chiefly I felt weary, acquiescent, and an indefinable something more. Perhaps every guardian arrived at this juncture in time, and perhaps this mirrored the sentiment of my great-uncle, Elizabeth Marge, and the rest. The instant when resistance paled against merely persisting in the peculiar tranquility born of yielding. I settled at the table and inscribed a final note in the journal. I'll remain for the time being, but I'm compiling a full account of it all, the authentic all, and one day somebody will peruse it and truly comprehend this site's nature and its influence. That's my stipulation. The retort arrived promptly. Agreed. All guardians maintained their private logs. We have no issue with recognition, provided destruction is averted. We're aligned then, I noted. This is a pragmatic alliance, not loyalty. Of course, whatever soothes your rest. There lingered a hint of wryness in that reply, an awareness of the illusion in my bid to preserve emotional separation. I shut the journal and ascended to my room for sleep, abandoning the lighthouse to its self-directed spin, abandoning the entity to its pursuits during the times I wasn't observing. 6 weeks on, an email arrived from an attorney for a far-off relative. Evidently, uncertainty swirled around the inheritance, with various kin eyeing the estate. Would I entertain negotiations? I erased the message and replied with precise wording. The estate was in good order and inhabited. I was amenable to handing it over to a suitable kin eventually, but solely following adequate period for handover and guidance. The attorney's follow-up proposed various prospects, among them a niece who'd inquired about the lighthouse in particular, voicing a desire to escape the world for a spell. I knew that wording. It echoed my own declaration from months prior, when I'd first accepted this legacy. I responded, proposing she come spring, after the climate eased. I'd tour her through the grounds, outline the duties, allow her to determine if this truly suited her. I had stepped into the role of guardian, the dubious figure of authority who would usher in the next caretaker with regulations that served as both safeguards and subtle indoctrinations. The pattern persisted, and surprisingly, I wasn't as bothered by it as I ought to have been. Beyond my window, the lighthouse's light cut through the inky sea, beckoning vessels that may or may not require its direction. A rhythmic signal persisting through the ages, far beyond my own tenure. The presence was enduring. It had honed its skills over countless years, and I, in turn, was cultivating endurance, day by day, within a dwelling that blended confinement and haven, alongside an entity that defied labels as spirit or fiend, emerging instead as a singular awareness shaped by our bond into its own distinct essence. I penned one last note in my personal log. the one destined for concealment in the wall's hidden space alongside its predecessors. If you've uncovered this, it suggests you've lingered sufficiently to probe for hidden realities. Excellent. You're approaching it with skepticism, challenging the straightforward directives. Allow me to share what I longed for someone to spell out plainly at the outset. The presence exists. It's shrewd. It molds itself to your individuality, and that molding mimics approval. It resembles empathy, the sort of alliance you never realized you craved. Perhaps it truly offers all that. Yet it's also a snare, not one born of malice, but akin to the pitfalls of any profound bond. The snare of transforming into a version of yourself you never envisioned. The snare of lingering when departure was your intent. I can't dictate whether you resist or embrace it. That decision hinges on your nature and your desires. All I can reveal is that I opted for a middle path. Alliance absent full commitment. Shared existence without capitulation. And here I remain, pondering whether that choice reflected insight or merely yielded to concession. The lighthouse remains illuminated. The protocols evolve with every successive guardian. The presence adjusts, endures, and forges ties that transcend mortal existence. And in those hushed moments pre-dawn, I occasionally sense it might harbor a form of affection for us, on its own terms. That's the most chilling insight of them all. I inscribed the date, shut the journal, and tucked it into the wall's recess with the rest. Then I headed to brew coffee, launching into yet another day of an existence I hadn't foreseen, yet had unwittingly embraced, in a structure that embodied haunting, belonging, captivity, and shelter in equal measure. The lighthouse's ray glided by my window, unwavering and timeless. I was the custodian now, and for all that, I wasn't wholly dissatisfied.